Monday at COP26, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau used his 5-minute speech at the plenary session to once again pledge that Canada will impose a cap on oil and gas emissions. Well, you can imagine the response that got from the industry and from Alberta Premier Jason Kenney. Well, I'm going to talk to Dr. Monica Gattinger, who's the head of Positive Energy at University of Ottawa, about what that all means. So welcome to the interview, Monica.
Thanks, Markham. Thanks for having me.
So what should we make of this announcement in the Prime Minister's speech?
I think this is a really important announcement. I mean, it's not a surprise. For one, this was something they announced on the campaign trail leading up to the federal election. But I think it's a really important next step for Canada. So, Canada's really at a hinge point on energy and climate, and there's much more consensus now around the need to move on emissions reductions. And this is not only in terms of the Canadian public's opinion, but also in terms of industry, right? We see a lot of industry commitments around net zero by 2050. So many of the oil sands producers have come together on this. As you know, I was just at a conference that's taking place right now, the Petroleum Technology Alliance of Canada, that is meeting around net zero by 2050. So industry is aligning behind this. So the idea that the federal government then says, okay, we're going to cap and cut emissions on the road to 2050 is potentially a really nice opportunity for that collaboration, frankly, between the federal government and industry.
Well, we'll see just how collaborative it is. And maybe we could talk about how they're going to do this, because it's not immediately apparent to me just what the mechanism will be.
Well, it's not immediately apparent to me either, Markham, and I think you're absolutely right. There's a whole host of questions here, and whether this will, open the door to collaboration or lead to lots of conflict and potentially national unity crises, I believe remains to be seen. But for me, there's just a large list of questions. At the top of that list for me would be, how are they defining net zero? And how are they operationalizing that, right? So of course, net zero means that, you've got the emissions part of net zero, but you've also got the capture part of net zero when it comes to, ensuring that you get to a place where you're not putting any more emissions into the atmosphere than you're taking out. And then the question really becomes, how do they operationalize that for oil and gas? And where do technologies like carbon capture, utilization, and storage fit into that equation? Because those increasingly and in many quarters are framed politically as a sort of delay tactic, as it were, or an opportunity to continue on with business as usual. So there's a big open question there for me around how they operationalize and define net zero by 2050.
Now, I have talked to an expert who made the point that the federal government does have the authority under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, CEPA, that it just amended last year, maybe it was even this year. But anyway, they could do what they have done in the electricity system, which is to set standards. So we're going to say, okay, every year from now for the next 10, 20 years, you have to reduce it by X amount per year. And I suppose that works. The problem, of course, is, especially if you're talking about the oil sands, these are big industrial operations. They do not turn on a dime. They don't do things in 1 or 2, or, they think in terms of 5 and 10 and 20 years. So I see he might have the legislative authority, but whether they can actually operationalize it in the time frame he's looking at is an open question.
Yeah, agreed. It's an open question. I think, 2050 to me really opens up the door to more creative thinking. The IEA's Net Zero by 2050 report had this great way of thinking about things, which is, between now and 2030, we need an unprecedented clean technology push. So lots of deployment of emissions reducing technologies. And then between now and 2050, unprecedented clean innovation, right? So we need to innovate. Many of the technologies we're going to need have not actually been developed yet. So this is where 2050 potentially becomes actually quite beneficial. So they've talked about, yes, capping now, but then reducing over the course of 5-year increments between now and 2050 to get to net zero in that time period. But there's still, again, to your point, even with standards, there's still a huge number of questions. Like, would this apply at the individual company level? If it does, then, what is the scope of what's counted and what's not counted? How does it happen at the sort of industry-wide level? Is this allocated, emissions reductions, how is that allocated across industry? Typically, when you do cap and reduce scenarios, what you develop is a trading regime, right? So you cap and reduce, but you develop a trading regime so that those companies who are moving faster develop credits. They can sell those into a marketplace to those companies who are moving more slowly. But that too opens up a whole host of questions around the politics of how you allocate some of these credits in the first place. And administratively, many of those programs there, it's quite a big machine to create. So there's lots of questions there, Markham, and it's not only sort of administratively and technically, but it's also politically.
Well, let's talk about politics, because it was only a few days ago that the Prime Minister shuffled his cabinet and installed Stephen Guilbeault as the new Environment Minister. Now, he's a former Greenpeace and Equiterre activist, very well known for his views about the oil and gas industry. Now, given what, and Guilbeault will, once the Prime Minister leaves COP26, Guilbeault will be heading up the Canadian delegation. What do you make of the fact that he appointed Guilbeault, made the announcement at COP26, and it all seems to be a bit of a piece?
Again, we will see how this all evolves. There was certainly some pretty concerned responses to his appointment coming out of oil and gas producing provinces, with the idea being, here we are at a point where we need collaboration, and are we appointing somebody who is or is not going to be collaborative? We also, as we saw in the broader cabinet appointment, Alberta, for the most part, kind of got a junior ministry. Jim Carr was not in the cabinet anymore. So, you can read that as maybe Ottawa is taking a combative stance. So that's kind of one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it, though, is, okay, let's give things a chance here. Let's see how they evolve. In any of the media interviews I've heard with the new minister since his appointment, he's been very clear. And I think this idea of, commitments around net zero for the oil and gas sector, that shows that the government is seeing a place for oil and gas in Canada's energy future, is trying to help chart a path forward for oil and gas and energy's future, in the country's energy future. And I haven't heard anything coming out of whether it's the climate change minister or the natural resources minister about reducing production. They're talking about, we need to collaborate with industry and others across the country to reduce emissions. So I think the jury's still out, Markham, frankly, on where this is going to go as we move forward.
Well, I'll give you my take on this, because I think that the Trudeau government, since it formed its first government in 2015, the Liberals did, have actually taken a very collaborative approach to the industry. They bought them a pipeline, did all sorts of things to help the industry out, and have been rewarded with, they've been beaten soundly about the ears by Premier Kenney. And I rather suspect that this was a bit of a shot across Alberta's bow and across the industry's bow. Yes, we're going to be collaborative, but we brought in somebody who is quite happy to hit you with a stick too. And I don't know, you're the political scientist. I don't know if the governments think that way, but boy, it sure looks that way.
Well, we'll really see where it goes. And I could see it going in one of at least two directions. The sort of more positive direction, me, Markham, I tend to be an optimist, is that the fact that we've got industry really aligned around net zero, or increasingly aligned around net zero, I think there's a real opportunity here for that collaboration between the government and industry, frankly, to maybe blunt some of the sharp edges of the partisan political infighting that we see on these issues. I mean, we know in international financial markets, sustainable finance, ESG investing, this is a direction that the industry knows it needs to go. And frankly, with the federal government, on board, as it were, with seeing a place for the oil and gas industry going forward, there could be some very interesting opportunities to actually open up the door for additional finance and the like for the sector. That's the positive side. The other way this could go is that it could become mired in conflict and divisiveness, and we could see ourselves in a national unity crisis. And then all of the effort that could be going to try to really bend that emissions curve downward once and for all in Canada ends up being, diverted to conflict and division. And I hope that's not what we're going to see, but I think it is something to be very mindful of.
Well, Monica, as always, appreciate your insights. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Markham.